Hey everyone, so today's video we will look at Savage rating and Mythic rating and compare the two. I did a video on what progression was like after hitting level cap, how gearing up felt, and this video is a continuation on that. Last time, I hadn't experienced Savage progression, so I didn't want to include something that I just researched. I wanted to actually have done it. Anyways, let's just get right into this, starting with... Okay, so getting loot in Savage is pretty similar to how World of Warcraft has been doing loot for years. Basically, once you kill the boss, you are locked out of loot from that boss until the instance resets, regardless of if you received a piece of loot or not. This is very different from normal, where you could just keep trying over and over again until you get the piece that you wanted. However, in Savage, you can get multiple pieces of loot off of a single boss. Whereas in normal, it was one piece per boss. The other way that Savage loot is changed from normal is that in Savage, if you skip ahead, you can no longer receive loot from previous bosses. I'll admit, it does feel like an archaic design choice to lock loot like that, but I'll go over why I don't mind it in a little bit. Lastly, in Savage, having players in your group that already killed the boss will lower the amount of loot that you can get. While I don't see this having much of an impact on statics, if you are using the party finder, I'd imagine this could lead to some issues with putting some parties together. Now I have to admit, when I first heard of all these caveats with Savage rating and how the loot was being handled, I was kind of disappointed. I guess I was spoiled with normals and extremes. However, upon further reflection, I can see why they did it. A big problem in World of Warcraft is boosting, where players pay to get carried through a raid and get all the loot. It got so bad that the joke became that the only people running in the party finder were sellers and buyers. No one was putting groups together just to play. So I think the changes to loot in Savage act as a way to mitigate that. I'm sure it doesn't stop it completely, but at the very least, the developers aren't making it any easier. So yeah, it's going to take a little bit longer to get full BIS from Savage, but at least it's far less RNG dependent than what happens in World of Warcraft. The way Final Fantasy XIV reduces this RNG factor is in two ways. The first way is that Savage bosses drop non-job specific loot coffers, so loot never goes to waste. This is also cool because if everyone has loot off of a boss, you can still take the coffer and use it with an alt, allowing you to much more easily keep your alt jobs geared. The second way is there's also a currency system, much like we see in Extreme Trials. In Pandemonium, every boss drops a currency called Mythos. The first boss drops Mythos 1, the second drops Mythos 2, and so forth. You can save these up and trade for the gear if you are getting very unlucky. When I look back at World of Warcraft, and the amount of frustration that came with getting loot, and realizing that sometimes I was never going to get my BIS due to terrible RNG. Well, this feels so much better. Anyways, let's go on to... Now, comparing the difficulty between WoW Mythic and Final Fantasy XIV Savage would be like comparing the difficulty between Dark Souls and Devil May Cry. Both Dark Souls and Devil May Cry are combat-based games, but the way they go about their combat is very different. Devil May Cry is much more fast-paced and rewards you for being aggressive, whereas Dark Souls is more deliberate, and being patient will reward you. When we look at World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV, while they are both hotbar MMORPGs that use the tried and true tank, healer, DPS trinity system, the way the encounters are designed is very different. So, instead of trying to do a direct comparison, I thought it would be more interesting to look at how these games make the fights more difficult. So, let's get the obvious one out of the way. Both of these games increase the boss's HP and damage values. Okay, now that we've gotten that out of the way, something the developers behind Final Fantasy XIV did to make Savage more of a challenge is that they removed many of the indicators that give players advance warning of where a mechanic would be hitting. That means in Savage, you have to be aware of what the boss is doing, because the only warning you get is the boss's telegraphs before an ability goes off. You can't just stare at the ground and wait for it to light up, and then react. Now to be fair, Extreme does the same thing, but extreme is like Savage with training wheels on. Then, of course, Savage introduces many new mechanics to the encounters, basically transforming them into a completely new encounter. Now, of course, World of Warcraft also adds new mechanics to the Mythic difficulty, and changes how some of the older mechanics work. I just think it's much more of a drastic change in Final Fantasy XIV. In World of Warcraft, these kind of sweeping changes are usually saved for the end of the tier. And of course, both games like to add brand new phases for their final bosses of the tier, which is always awesome. Now, something World of Warcraft likes to do, to increase the difficulty, is make more use of crowd control, which is something that Final Fantasy XIV does not utilize. It's not uncommon in WoW to have to set up interrupt, stun, and or knockback rotations in order to succeed. That is something I actually miss when playing Final Fantasy XIV, but I suppose the game isn't designed around that kind of combat. So the next topic will be the way it feels to progress on a fight is very important. I think that the way Final Fantasy XIV designs its encounters makes the progression feel really good. Here are 3 reasons I believe Final Fantasy XIV progression feels so good. Number 1, the fights have a cinematic quality to them, and the way Final Fantasy XIV achieves this is by having flashy attacks and spell animations, awesome transitions, and the music. These things add so much to the encounters, making them a lot of fun to progress on. Number 2, I think the fact that the raids are 8-person makes progression feel better. It's a smaller group of players, it's more tight-knit, and because the size is smaller, the developers can make sure everyone has to do something in the encounters. You know, other than what their roles require. I can't tell you how many times in WoW, even on Mythic, where many of the mechanics are done by the chosen few. Number 3, I also feel that because Final Fantasy XIV is so balanced, and that the fights are designed to be beaten with any combination of jobs, that it just feels really good going in. I always felt annoyed when I had to fight for my position in a progression fight, because I wasn't playing a Flavor of the Month class. The other thing about progressing in Final Fantasy XIV encounters is, it's hard to articulate. The best way I can describe how progression feels is like learning how to play a bullet hell game. The first time you play a level in one of these games, you will die a lot. You have to learn all of the patterns and get the positioning down, and then eventually, it just all clicks into place and you enter this zen-like state where you just feel one with the game. Final Fantasy XIV really nailed making encounters have that kind of feeling. Anyways, I am not trying to imply that progression doesn't feel good in WoW. Raid progression in WoW was always amazing. I just find the way Final Fantasy XIV designs its encounters to be more enjoyable for me. Next up, let's talk about... So, raids in both World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV are heavily scripted fights. For the most part, you know what's coming and when. However, both games do have some RNG with the mechanics, so they aren't completely predictable. Now, something I hear often is that WoW fights are less predictable because they have more RNG with the mechanics. World of Warcraft certainly has had encounters that had some strong RNG in them, and the thing about those encounters were, I've always found them to be my least favorite to progress on. What I've noticed with fights that rely too much on RNG with the mechanics is that they tend to have the bad RNG and the good RNG. What this means is, if you care about your rank, you could fall behind because another group got lucky with their RNG, while your group kept getting the bad RNG. That really isn't very fun. I have a really good example of this kind of bad RNG. In World of Warcraft, in the Firelands raid, there was a boss named Lord Ryolith. And the way that this boss fight worked was he would walk very slowly in a direction, and the DPS had to damage his feet. Now, the objective was to steer the boss by doing damage to the feet so that he wouldn't walk into the lava, and would walk over the volcanoes, that would randomly spawn anywhere throughout the arena. The volcanoes would do AoE damage while they were active. The more that were active, the more AoE damage. Can you sense the problem here? You could have volcanoes spawn in completely opposite directions, very far apart, over and over and over again, making it impossible to get rid of them in a timely manner. Because of that, this fight wound up being very annoying, and throughout the raid tier, Blizzard were adjusting this fight. The funny thing was that this fight was supposed to be one of the easier ones for the tier, but my guild kept getting such bad RNG while progressing on it that it took us forever to finally get the clear. In fact, we cleared all of the so-called harder fights much more smoothly than this one, because they didn't have such BS RNG. Now, I am not saying Blizzard hasn't tried to implement these kind of RNG fights since Firelands. They most certainly have. But I've noticed that those fights tend to be changed to have less RNG shortly after release. I think players overall do not like that much RNG in their fights, especially when the strategy was to wipe over and over again to force the RNG you wanted. Spirit Kings. So yeah, mechanic RNG in an MMORPG, I feel they need to be controllable and or avoidable. That's why when a random player gets chosen to do a mechanic, it's fine. That you can control. You know it's coming, and it's all about executing correctly. A fun form of RNG in Final Fantasy XIV is the boss might have multiple weapons that they choose from during a specific interval. You know it's coming up, you just don't know which weapon. You have to pay attention to the weapon and then know how to react accordingly. In fact, World of Warcraft had a fight with a mechanic very similar to that, probably one of my favorite mechanics in WoW. It was in the Mogashan Vaults, and the fight was called Will of the Emperor. The mechanic was a 10-hit combo where you had to pay attention to the boss's animation and react accordingly to dodge every hit in the combo. The order was completely RNG, but if you did it correctly, not only did you feel amazing and take 0 damage, the game rewarded you with an insane buff to your damage. Anyways, that was really just a long way of saying both games have heavily scripted raid encounters that also have RNG with their mechanics. WoW may have tried to make fights with heavier RNG, but in my experience, those fights never really worked and would eventually have those heavier RNG elements nerfed out. So, those are my thoughts on Savage and Mythic raiding. Obviously, I really love raiding in Final Fantasy XIV, but I still think raiding is a very strong suit in World of Warcraft. And if it weren't for a variety of other factors, such as all the chores and nonsense you need to do just to raid, I probably still would want to raid in WoW. Anyways, that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider leaving a like, commenting, and subscribing, and as always, have a great day.